So we're here to talk about capital absorption, and I'm going to interview you. And so there's going to be kind of a hybrid between an interview conversation and a presentation. And we're hoping to have you speak about the origins of capital absorption, the problems that we were trying to solve through the development of capital absorption, and a little bit about how it's been applied. So why don't we start with what led you to want to think about this problem? What were you trying to solve for?
Well, when you and I were working together on the integration initiative, we had the opportunity to bring different kinds of money, grant money and foundation debt, so kind of flexible money, and also bank capital to 5 cities that were defined as underinvested. And this was in 2010 when Detroit, was pre-bankruptcy and heading over the cliff. And Cleveland was hurting from the foreclosure crisis, and Newark and Baltimore and the Twin Cities. So we were working in 5 places where capital was really in short supply. And I think we went into that work with the idea that by bringing $15 million of grants and $15 million or even 20 of program-related investment from foundations, and a whole boatload of bank capital, about $55 million, that we would make those places less underinvested. Seemed like a good theory. And what we discovered as we started to do the work was that getting the grants spent was on the easier side. Getting them spent impactfully is always complicated, but you can actually spend money. But in order to invest money, you have to have investments that are ready to go and appropriate for the level of risk and the level of return that investors are looking for. And what we found in those cities was actually supply of capital was organized. We took care of that, but the demand for capital was not so organized. And that led us to really wonder, what does it take to make a place investment ready? And the capital absorption framework was born from that question. What would be the things that would have to be going on in a place in order for that place to be investment ready?
I know that this is a picture that you often use to sort of talk about the kinds of transformation that we want in places, going from abandoned and kind of empty of social value in some sense to this very beautiful playground with, we assume, affordable housing in the background. And so how do you see the capital absorption framework helping with this transition to going from this vacant and blighted kind of scenario to something that is thriving and allowing for different kinds of community needs to be met?
Well, so we all know that place matters. It matters for life expectancy. It matters for jobs and all kinds of life outcomes. And if places have been starved of investment by racism, by structural discrimination, by poverty, then the places that result look like the places on the left. And we live in a capitalist system where actually there is no economic incentive to work in places like the ones on the left, because there are easier and more profitable deals to do in places that are already thriving. And so the story of community investment is actually, how do you make money go from the normal kind of natural places that it would go in a capitalist system, the easy ones, to the places that actually need investment? And the story of community investment is, in fact, the story of making money instead of rolling downhill to the easiest things, kind of get pumped up so that it goes to the places that may be harder, but can end up looking like the place in the right. Okay. And the trickiest bit is, how do you do that in a way that benefits existing residents?
There you go, and not be an opening for gentrification and displacement. So I know that we have in the next slide this great question. What does it take for a city or region to marshal and deploy capital so that residents can thrive? And then we include here what is one of my favorite ever New Yorker cartoons, where there is a problem on the left and a solution on the right, and there's something in the middle where it says, then a miracle occurs, and the professor is saying, I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. So could you talk a little bit about sort of that step 2 solution, and I'll take you to the next slide.
Sure. So part of what we began to noodle over was really what were the things that had to happen in a place. And we studied 2 places, one where people said, you know, the community investment system is pretty functional here, and that was Chicago. And then we studied another place where people said, you know, not so good, and that was Atlanta. And we tried to figure out what was the difference in what was going on between Chicago and Atlanta. And Chicago by no means was perfect. In fact, many of the people that we interviewed and spoke to said, you know, if this is the example of a place where it's functional, we're in serious trouble. But what we did find was that places where more was happening had 3 things in common. There were 3 functions that were going on in the background that somebody was doing. And it turned out not to matter so much who the somebody was. The somebody could be a lot of different people, but somebody was stepping up and organizing these 3 things to happen. The first was they were organizing people to understand what were they trying to accomplish. Was it about affordable housing? Was it about creating jobs that were accessible to people in certain neighborhoods who might not have access to transit or good jobs nearby? Was it about creating mixed income, mixed use real estate? So articulating a set of shared priorities that went beyond, you know, one community organization or one group was really an important function. So it could concentrate attention. The second function was developing a pipeline of projects and investment opportunities that really, if they were moved and advanced, could add up to those shared priorities. And what we found here was that if you had a priority around small business development, but all of your deals were in affordable housing, did not compute. And then the third function was around enabling environment. And you know, what we said on this side is that if every deal is as hard to do as the last one that you just did, then you're fighting the context in ways that maybe are making life more difficult than it already needs to be. So what are the policies, the relationships, the institutional practices, the resource flows that could be worked on over time so that the system becomes engineered to produce a better result? And in the more functional community investment systems, these 3 functions were getting attended to by somebody, a community foundation, a CDFI, a cross-sector table. And these were the foundational elements of the capital absorption framework.
Lovely, thank you. So shared priorities, pipeline, and enabling environment as your 3 core functions that get braided together and that allow communities to organize capital and organize community investment to meet their needs. All right, let me move us to the next one. So community development is a heroic quest. Tell us what you mean and why it's important and how you think of the capital absorption framework as helping with this challenge.
Sure. So when we said that, you know, money in a capitalist system flows downhill and that you need a pump to get it to go uphill, what we found was that when we talked to practitioners of community investment, they told about their journey on every single deal as this kind of, you know, near-death experience. You know, I applied for the tax credits. I was put in the hold. I was in the queue for 3 years. The holding costs grew. The market changed. My development changed. And it really did strike us that, you know, if we want community investment to be a scalable activity, then having every single deal be this kind of heroic journey where Odysseus is trying to get home, you know, after the voyage, is not a scalable model. And what we were trying to move from was each deal is a heroic quest and then we rest for a while when we're done, to this is an activity where we approach deals in batches, where we think systemically about what would it take to achieve an objective at some scale. So not 30 units of housing at a time, but, you know, let's meet 30% of the need for affordable housing that's not being addressed? And how would we change business as usual so that we're not just going one deal at a time, but we're going up to a systems level?
So if I understand, the notion was that because people were thinking about it in a single deal, which was sort of its own epic journey, that then people were doing it on a one-by-one basis and not thinking systemically or systematically, and therefore not shifting the system in some way and really not able to meet the full span of community needs, or really orient themselves around solving community problems, but rather just around making small contributions. Even if those small contributions were 100 units in a mixed income, mixed use development, it was still one rather than a batch or a pipeline in your language.
Right. And as we've sometimes said, you know, there are problems that you have to enlarge in order to solve, which seems really counterintuitive. But if you're articulating a goal that is exciting enough and inspiring enough to get people who normally would not think of themselves as community development stakeholders engaged, and whether that's utilities or hospitals or donor advised funds, you know, people who might be inspired by something that is a vision for change, but an attainable vision, then you can actually move a much bigger bunch of transactions or batch of transactions with a bigger goal than you can project by project, deal by deal.
Excellent. All right. So this is, I think, an example of community investment, making money flow uphill. And want to just tell the little story about this and why it is such a good symbol for what you're trying to rethink.
Right. So community investment practitioners are actually awesomely creative human beings, and they come up with structures that look like this, you know, to pump the money up the hill. And this is an actual deal with the names removed to protect the innocent. And when you think about it, it is a tribute to human creativity that you can combine new markets tax credits and this kind of investment and this kind of investor and this kind of lease and the Community Development Corporation. I mean, it's really an amazing thing. But when you think about the hours of expensive legal work that go into a deal like this, and every deal is different, and how long does it take to negotiate the documents? This is not a scalable model. And so what we're trying to do when we use the capital absorption framework is to think system rather than deal by deal.
Love that. All right, let's go on. And we're gonna now go into each of the functions for the capital absorption system: shared priorities, pipeline, and enabling environment. We're gonna take them in order. So let's start with shared priorities.
So one of the things we've learned as we've worked on this for the last close to 10 years now is that there are some characteristics about the shared priorities that a community articulates that make them powerful. And these are the characteristics that are listed here. So there's an altitude issue we find. You don't want something at the level of, you know, the grocery store on the corner of 5th and Main, but you also don't want, you know, good things for all God's children, because making your city the most livable in the country is not going to shape anybody's investment decisions. And really what we're looking for is something that kind of helps people converge on a set of decisions that move an objective. And so what we're looking for in shared priorities are things that are authentic, that come from the community, that residents have been involved in formulating and in applying, that go across a fairly wide spectrum of stakeholders, that can be articulated in less than 6 paragraphs. So the elevator test of, you know, I'm in the elevator with the investor by the time I get from the 10th floor, this is a pre-COVID kind of analogy. By the time you get from the 10th floor to the ground floor, you have to be able to say what you want. They have to be systemic. And so people have to understand, you know, it's not just this one thing. How does this move a system? And they have to be related to opportunities and needs that are timely, that are in the system. So for example, now in an era of awareness of racism post George Floyd's murder, in an era of COVID and economic crisis, if you're not addressing those kinds of crisis needs, then you really don't have legitimate shared priorities.
Mhm. And so the notion here is that shared priorities provide both direction, impetus, urgency, and that they're specific enough to allow for decision-making and prioritization of resource allocation.
Right, and broad enough to attract a wide array of stakeholders who can get on board.
Right, and who can help build the political will and kind of the problem solving to get it done. All right, so let's look at pipeline. So why a pipeline?
So as I mentioned, if we just go deal by deal, we're going to actually, in many cases, go backwards, because in cities like LA and other hot market cities, you actually lose more subsidized or affordable homes every year than you're producing. And so if we're not thinking about groups of deals, then we're never going to get to the numbers that are going to make a difference. So once we think about pipeline, we begin to understand that we have a set of choices, and we can make decisions that say, hey, you know, if we start here, this is going to be catalytic. It's going to unlock other things. So we can really understand what to do first and sequence things in an order that's logical. We can make sure, as I was saying before, that we're not trying to solve a small business problem with an affordable housing solution. So the deals have to address the shared priorities. We can reduce the costs. So if I'm trying to build housing in the Coachella Valley, and I'm trying to attract a developer from Los Angeles, and I say, hey, you know, we have one deal that you should take a look at, he has to justify 90 minutes of traffic, at least, you know, at 3 a.m. from LA to the Coachella Valley. If you say, hey, we've prioritized the revitalization of these 2 neighborhoods, and that's going to mean multiple deals, several hundred units, you change the economics of what it means to work on those transactions in a way that makes them more doable. It also allows you to see where things go to die. And so in many places, there is kind of a predictable level of dysfunction that says, okay, I'm good until I apply for a tax credit, and then I have to wait for 3 years. And so once you look at kind of how deals in a pipeline progress, it helps you identify what are the policy and contextual areas where you could fix it.
All right. So let's look a little bit at the pipeline and kind of what the phases of the pipeline are. And you can just gloss over this. I know we'll be talking about this again later.
Sure. So one of the things that we've learned as we've applied the framework in multiple places is that there are different actors that are involved at different stages of developing the pipeline. The very first stage is to actually understand where the opportunities are. And so you need somebody who can understand what is a strategic parcel if you're looking at real estate, or what's a business that's about to go through a generational transition, or might be facing an opportunity because it's in a transitional neighborhood. So those are the opportunity spotters. And then there are the people who take those opportunities and figure out, should this be 30 units of mixed income housing, or 100 units of subsidized housing, or 10 units of single family housing? And those people have the kind of financial expertise or development expertise to understand, how do you match the requirements with the possibilities? And that's framing. And then there's a lot of assembling of capital and negotiating trade-offs and overcoming the barriers that cause deals to look the way that deal looked before, and getting through the processes that every individual investor goes through before they're willing to write a check. So you can bring together different actors to do these stages. It doesn't have to be one actor that goes all the way through.
All right. And so the notion is that different actors at different stages, and also different deals at different stages, but however many deals there are in the pipeline at any stage in this process, they're all aiming to the same set of shared priorities.
That's right. And you keep the water flowing.
Keep the water flowing. All right. So you have this idea of deal as system events. So not only is it not just one deal, but the deals that you're doing, you think of as system events. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So every deal, and even the failed ones, even the hard ones, is a learning opportunity, because a deal is the product of the system that produces it or hinders it or advances it. And so part of what we want to do when we're doing a deal is pay attention to where do the things get stuck? How do we use a deal to experiment with new ways of doing things? How do we use a deal to explicitly lay the groundwork for relationships that have power beyond the individual transaction? And so what you really want to do in a deal is think about what are the impacts, how many units of housing, how many businesses, how many jobs, but also what are the system effects of the deal and how can we strengthen both sides of the impact, the system impact and the social impact.
Lovely. All right, deal a system event. And then keeping with the sort of special deal, the deals that have multiplier effects, what makes a deal or a fund catalytic?
Well, so some deals allow you to do other things that wouldn't be possible. And so the first time that a CDFI, a community development financial institution, provided financing to a grocery store, that had not been done before. And then it turned into a batch of deals, and then it turned into a large batch of deals, and then it turned into an actual funding source from the federal government. And so what makes a deal catalytic is you're demonstrating a new product, a new way of doing financing, the fact that a certain kind of project or deal actually can pay the investors back. It may bring new resources into the system. So let's say in Boston, we're working with hospitals, and the first deals that are being done by developers who are using community benefit dollars show people that, hey, I can return those community benefit dollars either in the form of lower rents or in the form of a low interest loan. Mm-hmm. And so you bring other hospitals in. So that's the new types of actors and resources. You can have existing folks play a new role. So mm-hmm. Up until now, I've been giving you a loan, but now maybe you need a guarantee, because mm-hmm. you can do something bigger if people know that if you get in trouble, I'm behind you. And so if you can get an existing actor to take on a new role, that's very helpful. And you can also demonstrate breakthroughs, as we said, with going for the first time to a neighborhood that hasn't had capital. We had mm-hmm. experience in Detroit where no loans had been made for 10 years. The first loans were scary. After that, it was not scary at all.
Mm-hmm. So this notion that you show that something can be done, and then you don't have to be a superhero to get it done, and then other people can do it.
It's the 4-minute mile.
It's the 4-minute mile effect.
Once the first person broke it, there are a lot of people who went through.
That's right. All right. Yeah. So talk a little bit about the enabling environment, which is the third function.
Right. So here we're talking really about shaping the context, because it's the context that either makes things easy to do or hard to do. And usually when we talk about that, people immediately think about policies. So mm-hmm. they'll think about zoning or density or whether they can do land value capture. And policies are certainly an important part of doing community investment, but they're only one part. And so thinking about funding flows, for example, how are discretionary dollars being allocated? Are they going to the shared priority that's been identified, or are they going, walking around money for city council people? So funding flows are really important. Skills and capacities. So who is doing the work that gets the pipeline through the different stages that we identified? Who's doing the work of organizing community voice so that we actually know what the priorities are for residents and small businesses? Making sure that the relationships exist so that the people who could be investing in each other's deals know that those deals are happening and are talking to each other about how they might do more effectively, more efficiently. Are there platforms in which stakeholders in the system get together and problem solve at the level of the deal, at the level of the system? We've seen in some places that we've worked that they have muffin days, where developers and investors get together, and at those muffin meetings, they really are able to increase the throughput of deals. Mm-hmm. So that's what we mean by the platforms. And then there's data. It's really hard to know where you might use public land for public purpose if you don't have an inventory of where is that public land, or where is there expiring subsidized housing that you might want to make sure you get in and preserve before it goes away. So using data effectively is another aspect of the enabling environment.
So 6 really key functions for enabling environment. Let's talk a little bit here about, just as an example of the kind of capital stack that might get built using these principles.
So one of the things that community investment does effectively is it takes investors who have different kinds of money at their disposal. Some people have grants, some people have bank loans, some foundations have program-related investments, and they bring them together in a layer cake, which is called a capital stack. And by making sure that everybody gets what they need in terms of return, in terms of how much risk they can take, you can build a capital stack that uses the money at the bottom, which tends to be grant money or subsidy money, to unlock a whole bunch more money at the top. So what you see here is a $1.5 million guarantee, which was a promise. Nobody even had to write a check. And because the banks got that $1.5 million promise on an affordable housing fund, they were willing to provide nearly $11 million of capital that, had that guarantee not been there, would never have gone to affordable housing. Mm-hmm. So what you do in a capital stack like this is you put the different kinds of money together so that you can unlock capital from investors who are interested in the impact, but for sure interested in financial return.
Wonderful. And we can see sort of here in the commentary just all the different kinds of agencies and actors that come together then in this kind of leverage process. All right. So what do you see as the opportunity? And here we're starting to wrap up.
Well, so a few things. One is that this is not work that gets done alone by any single organization or by any single sector. It's a collaborative activity by its nature. And the more effective that collaborative becomes over time, the greater scale and impact it can achieve. The second thing is that we really believe that equity has to be at the center. It doesn't get there all by itself. Finance, as I said from the beginning, looks for return, and return is not about equity. So somebody has to be the steward of the mission that puts equity at the center and keeps equity at the center, even as people are making trade-offs to get things done. We really find that people approach finance as like a math problem, and there are elements of math in it that make it kind of partly technical, but it's also partly an adaptive challenge. We're trying to use this tool as a way to help solve big social problems. And by being adaptive in our thinking and really trying to say, what's a creative solution that gets everybody what they need, we get a lot further than if we're just doing the math. We also think that this is not a business as usual kind of endeavor. And so we're looking for people who are willing to experiment with new forms of equity, with new forms of debt, with solutions that maybe have not been tried before. And that happens best when people are coming at the problem from different perspectives. And so being open to the people who maybe are asking a naive question, but the naive question may have in it the seed of the solution. And then we're saying that this is not just a finance problem. Capital and policy both really have a role to play. And there are things that you can do through ballot initiatives and through changing policies and changing legislation that finance will never be able to do. And similarly, the legislation without capital moving is not going to get us where we want to go.
Wonderful. And then just really quickly reinforcing the things you've been talking about. This is our concluding slide. I'll turn it over to you.
So it's important to realize that no matter where you sit in the system, you could be the one who makes this stuff happen. There is no one function that's called community investment steward. And so if you're in a foundation or a bank or a community organization or a developer, a CDFI, you can be the person who convenes and helps bring people together to solve the problem. And then the path is pretty clear. You start from what's the important problem, you back map what would it take to solve it. You try to figure out, do we already have deals moving and we just have to accelerate them? Or do we actually have to create them? And if we have to accelerate them, what's getting in the way? How would we change that? Who can we invite to the party that would help us? And where do we get stuck? And it's an iterative process. There's no perfect way to start. There's no perfect way to end. But we found that if people get in there and just kind of make a commitment to making it work better, there's a lot of opportunity to do a lot.
Thank you so much. So that concludes our fabulous introduction to capital absorption. And the slide here references the website and showcases both the 6-minute video explainer on preparing places for investment and one of the publications from the center. And with that, we will thank Robin and we will end the recording.
Great. Thank you.